Good morning, everybody. We are going to get started in about 5 seconds. Just about to share my screen. Okay, so good morning. Thanks so much for the time for today's session. My name is Graham Monroe, and I'll be hosting this with Jeremy. So I'm going to run through the first part, and Jeremy's going to run through some of the case studies. This is a small group, so if you have questions, feel free to just speak up during the session. But yeah, looking forward to getting through some what we think is some pretty compelling material. By way of background, both Jeremy and I have product backgrounds. I started a company in 2014, after having wanted to do that for quite some time in the content marketing space. So I started a company in Flashstock. That company grew really quickly. I did a bit of angel funding, and then we were about 150 people, was thinking about doing some venture, and ended up getting acquired by a New York-based company, Shutterstock, a public stock photo provider. And so sort of reflecting on that journey, one of the key areas that I think was a huge contributor to our success was our ability to learn about our target customer really quickly and build solutions that solved a particular need and pain point. And in reflecting on where I wanted to spend my time after building that last company, it was really focusing on those skills. Basically, the notion that if you can walk into a room and identify people's most pressing problems, you're able to flex your creative muscle and potentially build some really innovative solutions that the market hasn't seen before. And so I've made a concerted effort to focus on that space. And I'll be joined with Jeremy, who I've worked with for a long period of time. Jeremy was employee number 1 at Flashstock, so he was there as part of the journey. And we've been working on this content really as a passion project for some time, because we do think the area that we're focusing on is just so critical to the success of both starting a new venture, but also making sure that your product is durable and stays in the market for a long time. We focused on this session particularly in the New York area. We've done a few broader sessions, but we found that once the attendee list gets over a certain number, we don't get any dialogue. So we decided to try like a really geo-specific one. And obviously we have a lot of passion for New York given our previous company. So if there are questions, please don't hesitate to reach out or speak up. So in terms of why this workshop, so why we're doing it. So when Jeremy and I finished at Shutterstock, we dug into product, and so this is really the third roundtable, which was based from research that we've done over the last, let's call it 9 months. So the first roundtable was really about trying to talk to founders and heads of product to really understand in the B2B space, like what are they really struggling with? Like what's top of mind for them? 3 themes emerged. So we interviewed 50 or 60 chief product officers. The three themes that emerged for B2B was, number one, this notion that, if you're building product for a B2B customer, you're not doing their job every day. And so you have to do your best to have empathy for their job and try to understand everything about them. But there's inevitably going to be a gap, and then that gap can cause some real problems. So for example, if your sales organization has a different perspective of what the customer actually needs, and you as a product leader are building something different, that's going to cause huge friction. And so there's a real challenge on how do you shrink that gap. The second theme that emerged was making sure that everyone understood the why in the context of the customer. And so obviously an early stage company, super important, but more about what they're trying to achieve, what the business outcomes are, what their business problems are, and focus less so on the solution. This is something that gets lost as a company grows, and it's a big part of where founders and heads of product need to spend their time, is explaining why and explaining that North Star in conjunction with the strategy. And then the third was just making sure everyone understands the constraints of product. And so if you're building software, you generally have a limited amount of resources. And so the things that you could do is going to outweigh what you can actually do, and making sure people understand those trade-offs and why you're making those trade-offs, both the obvious stuff like the features everyone sees, but also what's happening underneath the waterline, the technical debt, the infrastructure, the stuff that does take a lot of time. So out of the first roundtable, those are really the 3 challenges. And so what we took away from that was, okay, there seems to be a real challenge here on how you can understand what exactly the customer needs. Because if you understand what the customer needs and everyone in the organization is on the same page, a lot of those challenges in the first three themes start to go away. And so the second one we did was really doubling down on how founding teams and product teams actually do research themselves in the B2B context. And so this is for organizations that don't necessarily have a dedicated resource function. So they're not at that size and scale. And so here's a list of problems that were benchmarked from a similar volume of interviews, call it sort of 50, 60 interviews, where the top three problems were, okay, we've learned a bunch of stuff. How do we actually organize that in a way that we can process it and identify patterns? The second part is like, how do we actually take these inputs from customers in a really unbiased way? And so this obviously is how do me as an interviewer ask the right types of questions, but is also how do I make sure that if people are giving me feedback on what the product or the solution should be, that I'm removing their biases as well. And then the final piece is like, how do you balance taking that long-term multi-quarter view in terms of where your product is going to go versus like the immediate fires and the customers that are asking and demanding for certain things. So those were the top three. And so what we decided to do for this next series of roundtables is actually provide a framework on how to do research effectively, both in the very, very early stage where you've just got an idea, as well as when you've got a much more mature product. So what we're going to do in covering that is talk through the framework, and the framework's been road tested with several customers, so it's very practical. There's an opportunity to sort of assess your current capabilities, and then we're going to just run through some case studies. Part of this is we want to make it as actionable as possible, so we want you to walk away with something that's useful. And so we've provided some of the templates that we've used in this process and in this process of working with some clients that you can start using right away if they're helpful, and then allocate some time at the end for questions. But again, small group, if you do have questions, don't be shy, blurt them out. We are going to do a survey at the end. We're doing this for the passion of product and entrepreneurship. So if there's something you like or don't like about the content, that feedback is super helpful. Okay, so what we've done to prepare for this, so we've studied the problem over, let's call it the last 9 to 12 months, over 250 interviews from really top B2B companies, where we've targeted specifically to dive into this topic. We've taken our experience, the sort of best in class from those conversations, as well as some actual practical inputs where we've run a series of engagements with some of the companies that we've spoken to on how to actually do this. And we've walked away with what we think is a pretty lean, effective, and decisive process where you as an organization or an individual can learn really quickly about your customer. And so we've tried to wrap that up as best we can into this workshop that's hopefully helpful to you and your constituents at your companies. So sort of from a philosophical perspective, if you're an early stage founder or you're running a product group, your priority and your ability to sustain anything that you do is how quickly and effectively you can learn. And so we all sort of appreciate this at that top level, but the earlier of a stage you are, the more important this is. And it's also the harder it is. So the bigger you get, the less access you have to have these types of conversations in the B2B space where you can learn in a really structured environment. And so in reflecting this and sort of reflecting through the journey of like starting a company or building a product, trying to communicate what the body of work is that people need to do when they show up to work every day. And so not everyone is just going to have a bolt of lightning to come up with some crazy innovative idea that's going to change the market. 99% of the time, those insights are a result of dedicated hypothesis-driven research. And so the body of work that any entrepreneur or any creative person or any product person needs to focus on, at least in part, is the ability for them and their organization to learn. And so sort of created this diagram to articulate that, where you have target customers that you think have a particular problem. Your job is to validate that that problem actually is a need in the market and there's a quantifiable value to that need. The way you do that is through qualitative interviewing mixed with some sort of quantitative assessments of what the market size is, if you like, but I would say that's really secondary. So your ability to do that really quickly is going to basically dictate whether or not you're successful or not in the early stages. So once you've identified a particular need, you're clearly not done. You have to build a solution where the value proposition of the solution matches the need of the customer. So now you're taking that right back to those target customers and you're getting feedback. And so you can quickly see how this learning velocity becomes critical to figuring out what product to build, how to position it, what the pricing should be, what the competitors look like, how you can actually reach those customers. And so building this practice, both for you as an individual, but as well as within your organization, is super critical. And so really the discipline is broken down into 3 specific areas. Is number 1, learn with intention, which is there's a bunch of stuff that you don't know. It's your job to go and learn those things and remove as many assumptions as possible. But when you're going out and learning, that you have a really dedicated goal and you're going to go after it no matter what. The second time is to make sure that you're dedicating regular time in practice. This stuff is super hard, and if you're not carving out time, it just won't get done. And then the third is recognize that this is a learned skill, and if you take the time to learn it and optimize how you do it and consistently strive to get better, you will be able to shorten these learning sprints down to a matter of days, which is going to pay off in dividends for your organization. So how we do it and the framework that we're building really focuses on 3 key areas. And so this is particularly relevant for people or organizations who may not have at their disposal a huge volume of target customers. Especially in the early stages, like when you're trudging away very alone, being able to get in touch with the people that you want to talk to is super critical, but it's also extremely hard. So that's the outbound engine piece. The second piece is having a framework where you can quickly learn exactly what you want to learn without any wastage. And so that's the discovery framework. And then the third piece is how do you tie all this together? So how do you take all these little interactions that you've had and then identify the patterns so that you can action them in some form or another? And so your ability to do this is really what's going to drive a creative solution, which of course is going to be dubbed as an innovative product. And so this is really the nuts and bolts of that. So this is what we're going to dive into in detail. Okay, so the framework that we've put in place is really there's call it 4.5, 5 steps. So the first part is making sure that you are clearly articulating your learning goal. And so, here, if you think of the notion of a startup, it's really just an experiment. And you want to basically document that experiment. So you want to say, if this happens, then this should happen. Your goal is to validate that. And in the B2B space, if you don't have a ton of customers and you're not doing, in-app testing, that sort of thing, your best way to do that is through qualitative interviewing. And so first input is having a templated way to capture what you want to learn and the approach to get that learning. The second piece is building out who you're going to talk to. And so this is the list building component. So if you don't have people to talk to, how do you get those people to talk to? If you've got a mix of customers and non-customers, how do you think about that? Super important. If you don't have that, the whole process breaks down. The second piece is how do you actually get them on the phone, or how do you get them to meet with you or do whatever action you want them to do? There's a variety of techniques to do that, which we'll walk through. The third piece is once you've actually engaged that person, how do you ask them the right types of questions to get to your learning goal where you're not biasing the response and you're also being very respectful and reciprocal to the person you're talking to? And then the fourth piece is how do you actually pull out meaningful things from all of those conversations in a way that can impact your progress as either a founder or a product leader. So there's 2 big parts of that. The first 2, the yellow and green, is all about building your discovery funnel. And then the purple and blue is more around pulling out the learnings and then processing those learnings really quickly. So now we're going to walk through sort of each one in practice. Okay, so the brief. So a good way to start this process, if you're not already doing so, is to write down what you want to learn. And so this is really important because it forces you to articulate what's in your head on paper. And so that's a very powerful thing, both in your ability to verbalize and communicate what you're trying to learn, but it also brings everyone together so that everyone's on the same page if you're working as more than just the individual. There's different types of things that you want to capture depending on the learning. So for example, if you're launching a new venture or a new product or a major new feature, your brief is probably going to focus on making sure and validating that there's a particular problem or a need in the market. If it's more around pricing, it's going to be around quantifying that need. If it's around go-to-market, it's going to be around what channels people use to learn about new products and services. So there's a variety of things that you do. The main advantage of getting everything written down is it's really structured, which is super important. Like one of the pain points, if you remember from the few slides up, people have a really hard time managing all these inputs and outputs. It's because they're not structured very well. So putting that energy in to write down exactly what you want to learn is super important. We've got some templates that we'll share with you at the end. And it also aligns other people to the goal. So if there's people you're working with, they can read it, and within 5-10 minutes, they know exactly what you're doing. And it allows you to iterate and improve. That's the speed and decisiveness piece. So here are the elements that make up a really good brief. This is in the notion if you're working with a team and not as an individual. If you're working as an individual, you can sort of cut out more of the logistic stuff. So this is a brief structure that we would use for a new product launch or a new venture launch. And so your learning goal is really going to be about uncovering a need of a target customer. And so we like to have a structured hypothesis that pulls out 4 main parts. So we believe this persona or target customer has this problem because of this constraint, which results in this implication. Your job as a researcher or an entrepreneur or a product leader is making sure that pain point is articulated. And this could all be a guess, but getting it in paper allows you to make sure that you can actually go out and validate. So once you've got this written, you can then break out the segmented persona and the specific workflow that they would actually conduct to achieve the job that they're going to achieve. And so this is important to take a first cut at. And if you don't know this, then it's important to work through it, because this is going to serve the foundation of how you actually interview them. But you want to try to understand their priorities, their workflow, the challenges, the constraints, and implications. If you have a good idea of what that is, that's really going to help guide what's happening. The third piece is making sure that you have some validation criteria. And so if you're trying to assess whether or not there's a particular problem or need in the market or some sort of obstacle or barrier in the workflow, you want to make sure that you have some predetermined validation criteria upfront so that you don't bias your results at the end. And so this is a common one that we've looked at before. So the person's like, yeah, I acknowledge that this is a problem. They do believe it should be solved. The third one, which is most important, is they've actually looked for a solution themselves. And so if they haven't looked for a solution, it means that it's actually not that critical. And then another thing that we find really important, especially in the B2B space, is they can actually quantify the impact. That's going to really help down the road if you're trying to build a go-to-market. And then you want to cover the logistics. So who are you going to contact? How many interviews are you going to do? When do you want to do it by? Here's the summary template, here's the tracking sheet, and here's the hypothesis summary template as well. So making sure that all of this stuff is pre-done, so it just speeds up the process of learning velocity. And so what you can see here is once you've got the brief structure and the templates in place, it's just a matter of populating the field. And so you're able to do that much faster for future briefs. The next part is list building. So this is an interesting one where if you sort of take the typical founder, or you take the typical product leader who's never worked in a pure play sales capacity, reaching out to people to have conversations and you don't know those people is really challenging. The reality is it doesn't have to be challenging, because that's what people do every day as a full-time profession. You just have to figure out exactly how to do it. And so this is where the meld of building the outbound machine as well as doing really good interviews becomes super important. So on the list building side, part of the reason why we like to articulate a hypothesis is because it pulls out relevant information around who you should be talking to. And so at the top, you see the hypothesis template that I talked about earlier. Embedded in that is the persona, which should map to a segment. And the segment is what you're going to use to ultimately build your list of contacts. And so, for example, if you're building a solution, it's machine learning to help pathologists do better analyze slides quicker, you know that your segment is going to be a certain type of pathologist. And so from that, you would ultimately build your list. In terms of determining how many contacts you actually need, there's some pretty good rule of thumb. So if your goal is to say, interview 10 initially, you can work backwards from there based on an assumed conversion rate to figure out how many contacts you would actually need. And so, for example, a 10% outreach to conversion to meeting is a realistic benchmark to achieve. Therefore, you need about 100 people who you haven't talked to before. Assume that this is cold for that conversion rate to go out and actually chat with. And then there's a number of ways in terms of how you identify the contacts you want to meet with. You can use Salesforce Sales Navigator, trade associations, websites, blogs. Like, you have to do the research here, but you should be able to get a list of names in the 100 range if you want 10 interviews using a variety of those tools. Now that you know who you want to actually talk to, the second part is acquiring their contact information. And so again, if you're familiar with the sales world and the enterprise sales world, you'll be very familiar with these tools. But these tools just basically help acquire email addresses, phone numbers, other contact information as well. If they're not customers, and of course, if they are customers that you currently have, Salesforce or similar CRM obviously is your best source for that, with one caveat being make sure you talk to your salespeople, because nothing pisses off a salesperson more than having a product or someone else talking to their customer without their knowledge. But for non-customers, LinkedIn Sales Navigator with some of these plugins like Zoom Info, Lead IQ is a really great way to get people's email addresses. And then, of course, if it's in an industry where there's lots of associations like trade magazines, you can acquire the contact information there. But your goal, just to summarize, is to build a contact list of the right number of contacts based on some assumed conversion rate. If you have historical data, even better, because you could be more accurate. But you do want to have a particular volume. And then once you've got that list of people, go out and actually scrape how you contact them or get referrals, whatever you need. So the next piece, so now that you've built your list, is how do you actually reach out to people? So this is the assumption that this isn't an existing customer, or this isn't a referral from your network. Those are really good starting points, especially like a network, because you can have a meeting really, really quickly. I do recommend that you do include a lot of cold, and the reason being a cold is, for me, is my belief that you can actually get a stronger signal from someone who you don't have a relationship with. So making sure that you can do this outreach really, really effectively and predictably and not be dependent on your network is going to help you speed up your learning process. And that's a huge takeaway. So even if this part is really hard and makes you uncomfortable, you will eventually run out of people you can network with. And so having this muscle is going to be really beneficial. So depending on what industry you're in, how you reach out to people is going to differ drastically. And so if your customer is a digital marketer, digital means is going to be very straightforward. They're going to be responsive to emails and LinkedIn, et cetera. If your customers are in the manufacturing field, they're probably not going to respond to that stuff. And so you're going to have to use other means like calling, et cetera. We do find that, making sure that you're targeted with personalized messages where you're doing at least 3 to 5 follow-ups is the best. Customers obviously easiest to start with network, including important. And then finally, the tracking of the conversion rates is really, really useful. Remember that this isn't something that you're going to do one-off. This is something that you should be doing every week, even if you've got a successful product, because there's always things that you want to learn. And tracking conversion rates, and there's a series of tools that you can use to help do this, is a good way to just see how you're doing and how you're optimizing your messaging, because that has a direct impact on how you can actually outreach people. To make things easier, we recommend building out some templates. So, templates for cold outreach, either email, LinkedIn InMails, or cold calling. It just removes a barrier for people to get started. You want to actually tailor those templates when you want to use them, but having that baseline template is really important. Optimizing by channel, obviously, is obvious. Like if you're DMing someone on Twitter versus emailing them, you're going to have a different structure. You do want to customize, and then make sure that there's a bunch of tools out there that allow you to track conversion. Make sure you're doing that and optimizing your messaging based on that conversion. Here's a sample email template that we would use. So this is an example where we're reaching out to, say, a head of sales at a B2B company, and so we know that they're going to be responsive to email, and so we like to keep the emails in this sort of structure where we have a very complimentary / personalized introduction, a quick summary of what we're trying to do. We don't want to give too much detail here because probably won't read it, and if it's too cumbersome, they'll just move on. Asking them for help and being very deferential to their experience is important, because, if you think about it, they're in this position where they know something and you're trying to learn what they know. You have to be respectful of that hierarchy and making sure that you're making that hierarchy clear. If you're not actually selling something, make that super clear, because people hate to be sold to, especially by surprise. And so we find that if it's purely research-based, you're going to get a much better response rate if you're not selling something. So make sure to include that, but don't of course do the bait and switch, because that will not end well. And then finally, have a really clear ask, like very short period of time over the next couple of weeks, and remove as much barriers to booking those meetings as possible. This is the type of stuff that'll get you more meetings if you do this well and optimize it over time. When you're booking meetings, so you basically have your contact list, you figured out what channels you're going to test, you've got your templates to actually message. There's a bunch of tools out there to help manage the sequencing of messaging, tools like Outreach, SalesLoft. If you haven't worked in sales, check out those tools, but they basically allow you to pre-populate all of your messaging, press a button, and then those messages get sent over a period of time. This stuff is really hard. Reaching out to people that you don't know is not natural. So it does take a lot of discipline and intent. And it's important that you dedicate a specific amount of time to just doing the work, especially calling, because if you put it off, you'll never do it. You do want to front load the research. And so a lot of stuff is deadline driven. And so if you've got a deadline coming up, it's better to front load your outreach so that you're booking meetings as quickly as possible, recognizing that people will book within a 1 to 2 week window. Track conversions, we actually find that, depending on the problem, if the customer has that need or faces that problem, they're much more likely to respond. And so when you're tracking conversion rates, the conversion data is actually a good signal that you're actually onto something, because if people aren't responding, it's probably not relevant or important to them. So you probably want to think if you're building the right solution. If things aren't working, don't keep doing it. It's super obvious, but the number, if you're in an organization with sales, you can commiserate with them over this, but if you're cold calling and you've called 200 people and you haven't had one connect, you probably should change it up. Like I said, there's some tools there, making sure you're tracking the data, and then have a shared space where you track your meetings on how you've booked them. This is really important because it allows you to see your progress as well as capture the high level data. And so we have a template that's super simple around how you actually capture the meeting progress that you've made. The next section is the interview template. So this is obviously super important, because if you ask the wrong questions, you're going to get answers that could send you on the really wrong path. And so you do want to spend a lot of time and thoughtfulness on this particular area. If you're working with more than one person, you should collaborate on this, so everyone is doing their interviews off of the same script. That's important from a consistency perspective, so you ensure you're getting the decisive results. The good news is if you've done the work with the brief and you've articulated your learning goal and you understand the persona, you can use that to guide your questions. And if you've done a good job on the brief, the questions kind of write for themselves. When you're writing the questions, the most important thing is that you're asking questions about how they currently work, not about opinions, future self, anything like that. You really want to focus on what they're doing today, and that's going to help you eliminate the majority of biases that are out there. In addition, you don't want to talk about your solution unless you're trying to validate a workflow that's related to your solution. You want to focus on a problem or a need, especially if you're trying to understand if there's an opportunity for a new product or a new product feature. When you're having these types of interviews, if one of your interviewees explains that they're having a challenge, ask them for real examples, because that helps solidify. You want to keep your questions to a relatively high level from a templating perspective, because you don't want the person you're interviewing to feel like they're being interrogated. You want to keep it conversational, but you have to really understand what your end goal is, so that when someone touches on an area, that you can dig deeper and get to your outcome and understand the context and the why. And it may be uncomfortable because you may be asking them a lot of questions, which isn't really natural, but making sure that you know your end goal and you have the framework of questions is super important. And this is hard, but you do get a lot better with practice. We've probably done 200 interviews over the last few months, and the first couple are scary, especially if you haven't done it before. But by interview 30, interview 40, it's super easy and you get really comfortable. So don't be dissuaded if it's a little uncomfortable for you. This is an important aspect when you think about how you want to question someone. So this is a good example where you're trying to validate a need. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're removing as many assumptions about that target customer with regards to that need. And so when you think about how you want to approach getting to the meat and potatoes of those questions, so let's say you have a hypothesis that's focused on validating that this problem too exists with this persona. You don't want to start asking about that problem right away, because that's going to bias the conversation. You want to start conceptually much higher, focusing on priorities, and then how they achieve that priority, and then what's the hardest part of that priority. And if they list the problem in your hypothesis, that's an extremely positive sign that this is in fact a real problem for them. And at that point, you can dig much deeper. In that same interview, if you ask them what their challenges are with that particular workflow, if they don't mention your problem, that's a problem because it's not a problem. And so you can dig into that at the end, but recognize that hasn't been top of mind, and that's a strong signal. And so in that case, they wouldn't have acknowledged that there's a problem. And then you can dig into that, but you don't want to lose sight of the fact that that's not top of mind for them. And so that's an example of when you're creating these templates, is making sure that you're starting at the right level and not making too many assumptions about their workflows, their priorities, the data that they have access to, how they work, even if you have history, because in many cases you'll be surprised. The next one is interviewing. So, this is definitely a skill thing, but also a comfort thing. It's always best to have one-on-one interviews. There's definitely the tendency for people to want to interview in groups, but it changes the dynamic drastically. You want to be respectful of people's time. So 15 minutes, you can be very productive in 15 minutes and get to the meat and potatoes. You can extend that. I wouldn't go beyond 30. Make sure you know what you want to learn going into these meetings. That's why I'm not a huge fan of like product people sitting in on sales calls, is because they're not going to guide that learning. It's much better if they're using that as an input to figure out what they want to learn and then going and actually with intent learning those things. When you're introducing yourself, make sure that you're providing the appropriate background, but you don't want to give away too much to bias the conversation. But you do want to build some rapport and get the person on the other end to trust you, which is a natural human instinct. And you do that through casual conversation. Record with permission. 99% of the time, people won't have a problem with that. And if they do, just take good notes. Keep it casual. No one likes to be, feel rigid and awkward and like they're being interrogated. Speak to people like people. A good way to fill the funnel from an outbound perspective is, if you've had a good meeting, is just ask them if they have any introductions or referrals that they could make you. This is also a strong signal. If they don't feel that you're a qualified interviewer and you're not focusing on a good problem, they're less likely to invest any social capital with an introduction. And so if they're willing to do that, that's a very positive thing. Make sure you have a good headset, the audio's good, all the like nuts and bolts stuff, clean your room, and talk. You should be doing the least amount of talking and try to make it as enjoyable as possible. One of the things that we've noticed is if once you've recorded your call, when you re-listen to a call, especially if you've been the main driver of the interview, you learn a ton of stuff that you completely missed. And it's quite shocking, actually, how you sort of reframe things when you're not being an active listener and an active engager. So re-listen to your calls, especially the good ones, and then listen to other people's calls as well and coach them and give feedback. It's super easy to bias people to get excited about your solution and ask them like, how great do you think this solution is? That's the stuff that we want to coach around. And so helping each other here is important. So interviewing correctly, the biggest thing here is focusing on facts. And so you might get a lot of like complimentary, this is great, I think you're really on something. Just kind of ignore that. What you really want to do is avoid any sort of bias. And the only way that you can do that is fact-based interviewing with real specific examples of the last time they encountered those problems. Everything else is just kind of nice. And just be very cognizant of the biases. So top 3 biases to be aware of that we find is confirmation bias, false consensus bias, and liking bias. If you're kind of aware of those top ones, and there's hundreds to choose from, it'll help you recognize them when you're in meetings. And there's a ton of good books around this sort of stuff. One of the things that we've done, which we find very useful, especially if you're doing a lot of this, is how to quantify problems so that you can have a quick rule of thumb objectively to determine whether or not this is something that is interesting. So we've developed a pain score. The pain score is completely up to you. We just find it's a useful vehicle. So when you're, in this case here, we're validating that there's an unmet need. And so it's an articulation of a problem. And so if the customer articulates the problem and has acknowledged it, believes it should be solved, has tried to solve it, it's part of their workflow, they can quantify the cost, they want to pilot, that would be a 10 out of 10. So the way that we've structured the scoring is we've weighted the different variables. And so, for example, has tried to solve it before is the highest weighting because we feel that that's the strongest signal. And so when you start to have lots of interviews, you can play around with these types of scores, but it's a really good way to give someone a quick high-level view of what you learned from a call, and then give them options to drill in with more detail, as opposed to just giving them your own direct summary. And so agreeing for yourself and your team what the structure should be is really, really helpful, because you can then start to link the evidence to the outcome. And so, for example, if they have tried to solve it before, you should be able to articulate what they tried and how much time or money they invested in that solution. And that's the stuff that's really useful in this context. When you're summarizing an individual call, this is super important. So, if you remember from the early first few slides, the biggest challenge that people seem to have was, how do you actually extract learning? So you have to put the work in here. And if you've had a good call, you've got to extract things. And so we find the best way to do this at the individual level is to capture the key points relative to the brief. And so again, the brief template mapped out a persona. You're trying to see if this person maps that persona and if they've in fact have that same unmet need as you've hypothesized. And you've got a really simple scoring to recognize that, as well as some commentary. This is really helpful if you're in an organization. If you're not in an organization, you can do a less pretty version of this, but make sure you're doing this work nonetheless. And then once you've had a series of calls, it's important to link it up to a conclusion and the next steps. And so here, if you have a hypothesis on an unmet need, you're running a sequence of 10 interviews, you want to summarize that. And so this is a good structure where we've seen a good summary, where you're in the B2B context. You've learned a bunch of stuff. You've learned about the stakeholders. You've got a list of interviews. You've got validated and unvalidated hypothesis across those interviews. You now have a better understanding of the persona. So the persona is super important, because you want to start to refine that, as well as the workflow or job to be done and the challenges. And so that encapsulation is going to be super critical for any future product, as well as go-to-market. You want to make all your top learnings really accessible. And then thinking about go-to-market, because you've gone through the exercise of reaching out to people, you understand the messaging, you understand what works, what doesn't work. Capture that stuff, because it will serve you down the line. And then if you are you unsure how big the market is, like having some sort of quantitative overlay just really helps tell that story. How many meetings is enough? So basically, the idea here is this concept of learning saturation. You want to learn stuff. And so at the point where you stop learning is a good time to stop. And so, for example, if it's the first time you're interviewing in one particular industry, it's going to take you a long time before you start hearing patterns. As soon as you start hearing patterns, you probably want to move on. We find 10 is a good amount, because you're usually going to hit saturation by at least 10. The first 3 to 5 patterns will emerge. After 5, you can start to see the patterns, and then you can choose if you want to continue. But we start to see, pretty significant diminishing returns after about 10, if you have a good hypothesis statement. Connecting it all together, the one sort of takeaway here is every part of this process has a useful outcome. And so when you write the brief, every element of that brief is going to feed your discovery framework in terms of objectives, lists, contacts, the templates. And then when you actually have those calls, making sure that you're processing the learnings and sharing those learnings is equally time intensive, but equally important, because it'll drive your roadmap, your messaging, your pricing. And if you're able to do this really well, everyone is just going to be much more effective. I'm a little slow here, so I'm going to skip this, but here's the idea here is, if you're part of an organization, you should be able to look at this and put yourself in one of these 3 buckets in terms of the level of sophistication that you're doing your research and discovery. And so this is based on the hundreds of interviews that we've done. We basically picked out the traits and capabilities of all the different organizations that we saw, and then they seem to cluster around these 3 buckets. The majority of B2B product, they're not doing this particularly well. There's no real structure. They're triaging requests as they come in, and they may have other people helping. In the middle, teams are starting to put some structure in place, but it's very much owned by the product team. There's not a lot of intent. There's more around just going through the motions. And then the level 3 is, intent. You've got multiple people across the organization contributing, not just within product. You've got a process, and the full gamut. And so this could be a good slide for some of you. So I'm going to pass it now to Jeremy to dive into some case studies.
Awesome. Thanks, Grant. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, that's good.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. Grant took us through an overview of the framework that we've developed over the past 9, 12 months. And in doing that, we had started working with a couple clients to actually implement this. And so what I wanted to do was take you through a couple of ways that this framework has been helpful for different types of organization. The first one is a startup on how to improve an existing product. The second one, I'll take you through an example of how a top AI firm in North America uses this framework for their quarterly stage gate to understand which opportunities are a go and a no-go. And lastly, I'll take you through an example with a professional services firm where they're starting to build out new products in general, and move away from just pure play services and needs to validate these ventures. And so let's dive into the first example. Around improving an existing product. So this is a startup company. They had just produced an MVP, one product lead, a couple of engineers, and they're building software around being able to plug into an existing CRM and optimize the RFP bidding process. So obviously geared towards sales folks. The initial solution was focused on optimizing for price for the RFP, but they were really struggling with getting product market fit and even getting meetings with their target customers. The initial thesis for this MVP was built with one customer. And so they didn't really know whether there was a large enough market potential. And so we worked with them to sort of craft two briefs, one for validating whether the existing market segment that they had built the MVP for was still relevant or it was just a one-time use case, and a new segment where they had hypothesized a different use case, which would completely pivot the company into a different direction. The target segment was quite wide, actually. When we first worked with them, it was across all architectural firms, engineering firms, construction firms, consulting firms, and we did this by design because we weren't sure which exact segment that we wanted to go after, and so wanted to capture a little bit of learning saturation across each of these segments. And so the result was quite fascinating. Using this framework and writing two briefs, one to validate the existing product and one to validate a potentially new product, it turns out that there was a sub segment of these four initial groups that responded quite favorably to the new use case. And so instead of just architectural engineering, construction, and consulting, double clicked into construction firms who tended to bid a lot on RFPs and learned that only construction firms that had a certain size of greater than 250 million in revenue actually cared about this problem. And so let me take you through what exactly this team was able to put together. So they first started off with the briefs and then booked a bunch of calls with their target segment using a bunch of different channels, whether that be phone, LinkedIn, emails. And once they were able to get in touch with them, following the framework that Grant had just shown you, breaking down the priorities, the workflows, the challenges, and the opinions of each of these folks that they were interviewing. Along with that, had developed a specific pain scoring criteria. So as you can see here, whether they acknowledge the problem, believes it should be solved, has tried to solve it before, and in this case, finishing off with a little bit of commentary and aggregating all those scores together. And so after about 10 conversations on the first brief around predicting win rates and optimizing for pricing, the client really quickly learned that this was fully invalidated. A bunch of invalidated, only one really validated, but if you look at the overall persona and the aggregation of all the pain scores, just not a problem that was quite relevant for this group. So it actually invalidated their first MVP. But on the flip side of things, with their second opportunity and the second brief that they had launched with a totally different market segment, we started to see that there was a polarizing mix between invalidation and validation. And then when we started grouping and looking at the patterns between the validated hypotheses, it turned out that there was definitely a subsegment that cared about this problem in the construction space, more than 250 million in revenue. This is a fantastic example of a top summary sheet that helps you communicate these learnings from an inputs and outputs perspective to the rest of the company. And we constantly heard that chief product officers and founders, one of their top issues was rallying the entire organization towards a singular North Star. And this is just a fantastic way of displaying that. And so one other tactic that you might employ is throughout these call summaries, each of these bullet points are actually linked to a snippet within the phone call or the Zoom conversation. And so there's a bunch of tools out there that you can do this. But for example, it just comes to life when I can click on a link and play it directly. Would something like that be useful for your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what that would do is allow us to see opportunities that we would not have. And at some point, the low-hanging fruit that is currently before us will no longer be present. And I think it's really important that.
So I'll pause it there, but you get the idea. Nothing replaces the voice of the customer in this case. And so removing the anecdotes, removing the bias, again, making sure that you're asking the right questions. And then once you're able to extract all those learnings in a succinct manner, just the distribution of that knowledge towards the rest of the company, so critical. The second case study I want to focus on is the quarterly stage gate at a top AI firm in North America. So we helped them because this AI firm is technology first, obviously, a bunch of smart technical folks, but didn't really have a ton of domain expertise in healthcare, in oil and gas, in all these different spaces. But the idea was throughout all their services engagements, wanted to see if there was a larger opportunity to actually build products in each of these industries. They had hypotheses in, hip fracture discharging software, doing GI pathology using machine learning, or maybe population predictions for pipeline regulations companies in oil and gas. And so the idea for them is every quarter, every 3 to 6 months, have a series of ideas that they want to test against and see whether they would fund each of those initiatives by bringing on a venture lead and with a little bit of seed funding. And so again, using the framework, this was really critical because with the brief, you're writing down all of your learning objectives, the full hypothesis, and all of that validation criteria to see whether you're actually going to fund this initiative or not post-discovery. We ended up training their entire team on how to use this framework as well. And so over the course of about 2 months, now they've got a really predictable, repeatable process for being able to do that. And the other thing that makes this so compelling is that with pain scoring and the structured quantitative that you're pulling out of it as well, you've got a way of benchmarking all of these ideas and hypotheses against each other. So again, indicating which ones you're going to go fund or not. So in the very first engagement, they had 1 validated hypothesis and 2 invalidated within a couple of weeks. So really stressing the rapid learning capability here. Here's an example of the top sheet. You'll see the stakeholders map, the persona, the average pain score. So this one was clearly validated based on all of the learnings. And they would have a breakdown of all the call summaries. And then 1 invalidated over here, pathology using AI, just because this problem wasn't top of mind for these GI pathologists. And then the last one around population estimation. So again, quick ways of comparing all of these ventures against each other. And the last example that I just want to skim through is there was a professional services firm that we helped implement this framework with, and they're a management consulting firm, but having built out a corporate incubator internally. And so they had this idea where they were doing a ton of manual engagements internally to help all of their case teams, yet they wanted to see, hey, there's a ton of action and we're doing the same work over and over again. Is there an opportunity to build an actual product here? So having built a hypothesis, again, a new brief, along with this corporate incubator, having no discovery framework in place, we had worked with them to understand whether there's an actual market here. The advantage of us in this case, we ran the interviews for them. The advantage was we were able to not mention the firm at all. So it was a total double blind approach, no compensation. I tried a couple of different channels and started to ingest the vernacular of what we were hearing from the market into the messaging, which increased our response rates. And so over time, the whole intent of this was, A, we want to show you what best practice looks like and good looks like. B, we'll help train you on your team. And then C, that'll allow you to have the methodology, the process, and sort of the tooling to continue to do this on your own. So within a matter of weeks, 2 weeks, they were able to validate this hypothesis, or invalidate this particular one around the investment community using competitive talent benchmarking data. So as you can see, pain score here. If you compare this to the very first case study, the pain scoring matrix was a little bit different. They had added a couple of different metrics and criteria, such as, is there a clear impact to revenue or cost? We're also weighting whether they want to pilot this or are willing to refer us to other folks. 0 out of 10, 0 out of 10. And we did stumble upon one subsegment at a 10 out of 10 pain point, which simply just tells us you probably have a new brief that you need to go write and double click into that hypothesis against that new customer segment. So yeah, that's a little bit on the framework and how to use it. There's a couple of examples on how it's been done in practice. So it's certainly been battle tested, and we can't wait to see what you do with this. What I want to leave you with are a couple of templates and slides that you can continue to use on your own if you'd like to. And we'll be sending you a copy of this deck as well as all of these links so that you can explore it on your own time. And we'd love it if you could fill out a survey and help us improve on our content. With that, I will open up the floor to any questions. Yes, Chris, I will be able to share the video presentation with everybody.
Hi, quick question. Hello, my name is Gail, based in New York, but currently in California. And I was wondering, you mentioned sort of scheduling and segmenting off certain amount of time every week just to make sure you actually do take care of these really important like interviews, these really important like outreach. Is there a certain amount of time you recommend doing that when you're like a founder and you're trying to juggle so many other things that you're doing as well?
Yeah, I think that there's probably two parts to that question: is when are people most likely to respond, and then also how do you dedicate that time? And so when are people most likely to respond? Anecdotally, we find that Tuesdays and Fridays are actually the best day. Like Monday mornings, people are busy. Friday afternoons, people are much more relaxed and they seem much more open. And so tracking response rates relative to time of day is important. And then on the other thing, I mean, that's if talking to your customers isn't a top priority as a founder, you probably have to look at what else you're doing and basically reprioritize. But I find dedicating at least sort of 1 to 2 hours a week of pure outreach is an investment very much worth making. But again, it's relative to your objectives.
Awesome, thank you.
Hi there, folks. It's Sinay here. I'm based in New York as well, and I'm still here. I running a company called Epop AI. So I wanted to ask you. This has been really useful to kind of see the methodical way of, collecting, creating, focusing the teams, collaborating, and then getting the feedback, whether you like it or not. In terms of then translating that for future roundtables, are you looking to do anything where you collate that information and then drive that or translate that into a product roadmap and prioritization, all the rest of it? Is that something you're looking to do in the future? Because that would be super useful.
Yeah. I mean, so generally the way we find, so the communication, so we spend a lot of time talking to people in like professional research capacities around what the best way is to communicate an outcome from a large body of research work. And so the pattern is basically needs differ based on role, but the common rule of thumb is there has to be a story. So there has to be a qualitative component, and that's what we find is best articulated through sound bites and actual snippets that you can extract from calls, where you're saying, hey, this is the person, this is the role they're in, hear them tell that story, and then you sort of you bookend that with the quantitative data. And so if it's a new venture, it's like, how big's the market? If it's an existing product, it's like, how many of your current customers feel this pain point? And you can start to extrapolate to tell that story. And then making that linkage really accessible to your roadmap and to your tickets becomes super powerful. So if you're an engineer and you're working on a feature and you don't really understand why, you understand the feature, but you don't understand why, you can trace that ticket all the way back to those sound bites and that bigger deliverable of the research where you can hear and understand the why. And so that connection from strategy to customer to story is super important. And there's a number of tools like, whiteboarding tools like Miro, Notion that make that really, really easy. But setting up that infrastructure and that structure will pay dividends as well.
Thank you.
Hey, this is Christopher. One quick question. Early on, you mentioned that you should not be trying to sell people when you're doing a discovery call.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned that you can propose a pilot. How do you view the difference in between what triggers you to ask that pilot question versus just saying thank you for the information?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's something that we've thought about a lot. I mean, obviously your intent is to solve a problem and build a product. I think people appreciate that. Generally the way I find to work most successful, especially if you are in the early stages of development, is you break it into two parts. So the first part is you want to identify people that have the problem that you're trying to solve. Okay. So when you've done that and that's actually a real problem and they've looked for solutions, they're going to be much more open to seeing a potential solution. And so I usually like to break those two sessions up. And if someone, let's say I have a solution in my mind, or let's say there's some aspect of it built, I don't want to play that card right away. I want to identify, hey, this person has that problem. So if that's the case, at the conclusion of that call, I'll usually say something like, hey, would it be possible if I followed up with you with a potential solution? And if they've identified the problem, the likelihood that they'll say no is very, very low. And so they're likely to say yes. And so then I'd book a follow-up and I would basically repeat back to them in that follow-up, hey, last time we spoke, you said this, you said you had this problem. So we've taken that away and we've got a potential solution. Can I show it to you? So now you're actually putting a solution in front of a person and you're going to get a much different level of response. And if it's actually a real problem and you've got a phenomenal product or a potential phenomenal product, what you'll actually find is people will ask, hey, when is this available? Can I beta this? Can I trial this? And so you're basically closing the loop through that dialogue. So the splitting of identifying the need and then coming back with a value prop that meets those needs is the best way to do that, but breaking it out over two sessions becomes important. And so you are in fact potentially selling them something, but not on that first research call because you haven't even built a relationship. But once you've had that call, you now have a relationship, you now know a lot more about that person, and then you can use that information to give them a solution that's actually going to help them.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I think that's it for questions. We're at time, so thanks everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate the time. What I'll do is I'll send over a copy of the presentation as well as the recording. Feel free to ask us any additional questions via email, please fill out the survey before you leave. With that, thanks for the time, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye now.
Thank you.